Okay, thank you very much. So my presentation will directly connect to the one before and try to apply these methods of balance mechanics in another way. And directly connecting to the first presentation, I would like to introduce first the idea of lockstep behavior that is relevant in many instances. And then the fields of application are twofold. First, concerning business cycle theory, Stützel has sketched a systematic of business cycle theories that I want to use to structure current approaches to business cycles. And I think that his system can be used and shows quite clearly what the blind spots were in the models that were used before the financial crisis. And the second field of application is economic policy. The question whether a pension system should be fully funded or organized as a pay-as-you-go system. And here balance mechanics can clear up the debate simply due to the fact that it emphasizes the different meanings of saving that may go into the hand of Geoffrey Hodgson and the confusion over these different meanings. Well, Stützel views the problem of business cycles, as we already heard, as one of the degree of utilization of the productive potential of the economy due to an increase or decrease of aggregate demand for goods and services. And in his system, net financial assets, or the increase or decrease of it, and the means of payment play a distinctive role. And now one important qualification concerning the difference between the partial, the relational, and the global statement we heard already is the idea of behavior in lockstep. And that leads to the peculiar result that the global statement also applies to each single economic unit. And referring to revenues and expenditures, that means that every economic unit has exactly the same amount of revenues as expenditures, so that there are no balances, or the existing balances stay the same. If all economic units increase their expenditures in lockstep, the initial amount of each person's net financial assets is no brake for increasing expenditures, as it does not change. If, for example, a unit possesses net financial assets of $1,000 at a certain point in time, that does not hinder it from making expenditures of $100,000. As long as it simultaneously receives revenues of 100,000. And as long as expenditures and revenues move in perfect lockstep, there is no limit to expenditures. And therefore, the stock of net financial assets at a certain point in time does not limit the expenditures even of one single economic unit, but only it limits only the possibility of deviating from lockstep behavior. And the importance of this consideration will become evident when discussing Stützel's business cycle theories. And apart from net financial assets, the possibility of lockstep behavior also applies to the means of payment. Means of payment are banknotes or checkable accounts. And in each period, receipts and payments of an individual can differ, so that within a period, the stock of means of payment a unit possesses can change. But one can also have lockstep behavior concerning means of payment. That will mean that each receipt a person receives leads to a nearly instantaneous payment of the same size. And in that case, the stock of means of payment a person possesses is not a factor limiting the expenditures of that unit. Quite the contrary, the person can process a large amount of payments with a minimum stock of money, with a minimum stock of means of payment. Now, let's come to the first application of his system, business cycles. Stützel develops a system, and in general, business cycles for him are due to changes in aggregate demand for goods and services, or, if we use his terminology, changes in total expenditures. And in the following, I will assume buyer's markets to be the normal condition in modern economies, so that indeed decisions concerning expenditures are the determining factor, instead of decisions on revenues or sales, as would be the case in sellers' markets. And these changes in total expenditures very often have causes exogenous to the economic process, say wars or other political events. And Stützel's aim is not to settle definitely when and why changes in aggregate demand come about, but to emphasize the relevant parameters of the business cycles and their interconnections. And his four model cases, you see here, leave room for different business cycle theories that can be more easily compared with one another if one structures them according to Stützel's systematic. So he sketches 4 model cases of business cycles depending whether they are characterized by a lockstep or simultaneous behavior of revenues and expenditures and or a simultaneous change of payments and receipts. And now you can draw this table. And when we take the model case 1, that is characterized by the fact that nearly every economic unit is trying to decrease its net financial wealth by increasing its expenditures. That might be due to a fear of inflation, as we heard in the mind of economic units, so that they try to avoid the loss from it by decreasing financial wealth and increasing their non-financial wealth. Another explanation might be simply a wave of optimism, an increase in optimism that leads to increases in expenditures. And if that is done by nearly every economic unit, one unit's expenditures are another unit's revenues, and the whole process can take place without significant balances, that is, without surpluses, significant surpluses or deficits. Therefore, there is no significant necessity of loans or credit. Even if each entrepreneur assumes that she has to take out a loan to finance her investment by increasing her expenditures, she increases the revenues and therefore the possibilities of self-financing of another entrepreneur. And if this entrepreneur uses these revenues for additional investment, she increases the revenues of a third one that can again be used for investment. And if additional wages are paid out, if these wages are used by the households for increasing their consumption expenditures, the firm's expenditures will almost immediately return to them, and so on. In the end, also the first entrepreneur who started the process might receive additional revenues so that his demand for loans is much lower than expected. And if, furthermore, the date of receipts do not deviate from dates of payments, then there is also no need for a large stock of means of payment. So, in general, this process is difficult to stop or to influence simply by monetary policy, be it by changing interest rates or by changing the stock of means of payment, the money supply. Psychological factors or technological developments might be much more important. And the whole process, of course, can take place not only in an upward direction, but it can take place also in a downward direction. The second model is an application of the quantity theory, or rather the naive quantity theory, as Stützel called it. It is the case where the amount of money, the amount of means of payment, can effectively limit expenditures. And Stützel thinks that this is valid only in an economy which is characterized by a high share of institutionally fixed payment dates. For example, periodically fixed payments of wages or rents. And on the other hand, transactions between firms due to the sale and purchase of intermediate inputs that can spread arbitrarily over the whole period should not play much of a role. And in this case, when the dates of the real transactions are clear, and when there are certain institutional regularities concerning payments, the quantity of money, however you define it, can have a determining influence on the level of expenditures. And here then monetary factors become important when explaining the ups and downs of the economic process. But Stützel himself did not think of this model to be of much relevance. And the reason for that was, in his opinion, the aggregate sum of wages depends on the whole economic situation. And that in turn is heavily influenced by the amount of transactions between firms. And here the quantity of money in use is practically insignificant. As long as firms can rely on checkable accounts or on credit lines, there is no possibility to deny them the amount of money necessary for carrying out transactions. And furthermore, a decrease of the quantity of money might simply lead either to an intensification of lockstep behavior, so that each unit economizes on its use of cash in order to carry out the transactions with lower stocks of money. Or maybe the firms will, like the merchants of earlier times, develop other forms of means of payment. Say, for example, modern forms of the bills of exchange that were, of course, no general means of payment, but that were used for transactions between merchants. Now, this third model emphasizes the importance for profits for investment decisions, and they start, therefore, with a Kaleckian equation for profits. So, say Q, the profits of the corporate sector, are equal to the net investment of the corporate sector plus the consumption expenditures of receivers of profit income minus the change in the net financial assets of the other sectors. So the change in net financial sectors of households, the change in net financial assets of the government, and the change in net financial assets of foreign countries. In other words, investment is a yield for the firm selling the investment good, but it's not a cost for the firm purchasing the investment good. Consumption expenditures of people receiving profit income are yields for the firms, whereas the distribution of profit is not a cost. Therefore, this consumption expenditure is a profit for the corporate sector as a whole. And finally, the increase of net financial assets of the corporate sector, which is simply this with a positive sign, the increase of net financial assets of the corporate sector is the higher, the lower is the increase of net financial assets of households receiving wage income, due to the fact that each wage payment is a cost for the firm. If wage earners spend all their money income on consumption goods, the resulting yields would just equalize the cost. Therefore, each euro that is used for an increase of net financial assets in households decreases corporate profits. Second, the lower is the increase of net financial assets of the government. That is, the higher is the government deficit. And also the lower is the increase of net financial assets of the foreign sector. That is, the higher is the current account surplus of the country. Now, the idea here is that investment decision of companies might be influenced directly by their profit. From the perspective of balance mechanics, it is clear that profit is determined by the factors here listed on the right-hand side of the equation. Firms can decide to spend more for investment. Households can decide to spend less on consumption goods, but a company cannot decide to increase its profits. But from the perspective of a behavioral relationship, an increase of profits in this period can lead to an increase of investment in the next period. So that might work like this. If, for example, households decide to decrease their formation of net financial assets by increasing their consumption expenditures, that might lead to an increase of corporate profits. That might lead in the next period to an increased investment and therefore to a general upswing in the business cycle. On the other hand, an increase in the formation of net financial assets of household that is not compensated by a higher government deficit or a higher current account surplus decreases corporate profits and might lead to a downswing. And this model can explain the business cycles when changes in the investment decisions of firms, changes in net financial assets, and therefore changes in corporate profits are large enough to determine the entrepreneur's actions, whereas the interest rate for taking out loans may be only of secondary importance at best. And that may be the case where the entrepreneur's chances of profits are so high that the increases of the interest rate are not sufficient to effectively break investment expenditures. Only a large increase in non-corporate net financial assets could cause that. On the other hand, it might also be the case that the chances of profits are so low due to low investment expenditures or high net financial savings of the non-corporate sector, that even very low interest rates cannot positively influence investment expenditures. And the fourth case lies in between the extreme cases of Model 1 and 3. And in that intermediate case 4, considerations of liquidity play a role, and the changes of interest rates can have an important influence on the entrepreneurial actions. Stützel himself describes it in terms of the relation between the natural interest rate, and for him that is simply the monetary yield you get by additional investment, and the money interest rate, that is the interest rate to be paid for loans. And if the so defined natural rate lies above the monetary rate, and if the potential loan takers have sufficient collateral, investment expenditures will rise and an upswing will take place. In case of large deficits, that is, in case of high indebtedness, an increase of interest might lead for problems for some firms getting enough liquidity, and it might become difficult for the firms to consolidate their debt, that is, to substitute short-term bank loans for long-term finance via securities due to higher long-term rates. And that might lead to a decrease of investment of certain firms, and even interest-sensitive sectors might cause further decreases of other investment expenditures, and therefore a decrease of aggregate expenditure in general. Now, in the description of this system of business cycles, Stützel refers to some examples of business cycle theories that were central at the time of his writing in the 1960s. Keynesian multiplier, quantity theory, difference between so-called natural and money interest rate. And the question is looking at this system, is that still useful today? And I would say yes, because looking at the different business cycle theories by using Stützel's systematic, one can quite easily see the blind spot of models, most models that were used before the financial crisis, and why certain problems did not come into the focus. My thesis is the large majority of business cycle models developed and used before the financial crisis fall largely in the categories 1 and 4. But to recognize the problems that led to the financial crisis, it is also helpful and necessary to think of situations and processes that fall largely in the category number 3. New classical macroeconomics, and especially real business cycles, developed in the 1980s and part and parcel of the macroeconomic theory since then. They're also a building block of new Keynesian macroeconomics, I think can be seen as an example of a business cycle theory of the model case number 1. The basic idea of real business cycles is that cycles are a rational response of utility maximizing individuals to technological shocks, be they positive or negative. The optimizing representative individual reacts to changes in technology and productivity by changing his consumption and labor supply decisions. A positive technological shock leads to an increase in the real wage and makes it profitable to increase labor supply so that production increases. And the reverse holds true for a negative technological shock. Central hypothesis of this class of models is that employment is determined by the supply side following the maximization of expected utility resulting from consumption of goods and enjoyment of leisure time. As other behavioral assumptions than maximizing utility are not considered, it's not possible to derive changes in the total expenditure by, e.g., waves of optimism or pessimism, but one has to rely on technological shocks. But what is important in the present discussion is the following. These models are essentially non-monetary, but they can be reconstructed as models with revenues or expenditures on the one hand and receipts, payments on the other hand that move in more or less perfect lockstep. Therefore, you have upswings and downswings induced by technological shocks that are characterized by no significant change in net financial assets or means of payment. And with this implicit or explicit assumption of lockstep behavior concerning expenditures and payments, This model falls into class 1, and many results that are characteristic for the real business cycle models can simply be traced back to these assumptions: monetary neutrality, interest only determined by real factors, and so on. One example is the textbook model by Robert Barrow that I analyzed in another paper. In his basic macroeconomic model, he explicitly assumes that in each period the stock of means of payment in the hands of an individual does not change. And this leads to the result that liquidity considerations play absolutely no role in determining the rate of interest, which also leads to the unimportance of monetary policy. The capital market is modeled as perfect in the sense that each surplus and each deficit leads at once to a purchase or emission of bonds to keep the stock of means of payment constant. Furthermore, surpluses and deficits are principally allowed, but they do not play much of a role. And so I think it's justified to subsume that under model case number 1. And these models leave practically no role for stabilizing macroeconomic policy because it's simply not necessary. All decisions are carried out by optimizing agents that always move on their intended demand and supply curves and change these decisions due to technological shocks. Macroeconomic policy cannot improve the results. The model case 4 is best represented by new Keynesian macroeconomics. It started with a perspective chosen by the real business cycle approach. That is, it accepted the idea of an optimizing, maximizing individual that strived for the intertemporal optimum of consumption and leisure. But it tried to make good the problem that monetary policy did not have an active role in the economic process. What is necessarily the case if one assumes lockstep behavior in expenditures and payments. Therefore, the new Keynesian macroeconomics tried to integrate certain rigidities in the process of price and or wage formation. Instead of perfect competition, the model usually assumes monopolistic competition, so that the firms have a certain scope for determining prices above marginal costs. But this price-setting process does not work perfectly due to certain rigidities. The reason for these rigidities are not very important. It can be due to menu costs, or it can be due to the fact that due to some exogenous reasons, only a part of the entrepreneurs can change their prices at each point in time, the so-called Calvo pricing. And the most important thing is that these changes lead to a stabilizing role for the central bank. The rigidities in the price-setting process lead at least temporarily to balances between revenues and expenditures, and also receipts and payments. And also aggregate demand in general is mainly influenced by the real interest rate. In case of a demand shock, that in turn also influences the inflation rate, the central bank, and the central bank then carries out a stabilizing interest rate policy. In the simplest new Keynesian model, there exists no investment expenditures. So monetary policy has to make sure that income equals consumption, so that saving actually equals zero. And here the interest rate policy has to make sure that no permanent differences between income and expenditures come into effect. On the other hand, the central bank has to defend an inflation target by increasing the real interest rate above the level that would lead to a full employment market clearing of the goods market in order to reduce the inflation rate if we have an inflation rate above the central bank's target, and the other way around if the actual rate undershoots the inflation target of the central bank. In the years before the financial crisis, this class of model was the dominating one when discussing business cycles and the possible actions of stabilization policy. Monetary policy became the main stabilizing tool. Fiscal policy was placed in the background. And the years before the financial crisis, or even the decades before the financial crisis, that were called the Great Moderation, seemed to confirm this point of view. Well, most modern business cycle theories do not rely on simple quantity theoretic arguments, so that Stützel's model case seems more or less empty today. Model case 2 seems more or less empty today. Nevertheless, in the wake of the financial crisis, arguments resembling the traditional quantity theory came up again. but not so much on a theoretical level, but in the form of policy proposals for so-called 100% money in the tradition of Irving Fisher, or full money as it was called. And the idea behind these proposals is to limit or even abolish the money-creating capacity of the banking system, as this capacity is seen, due to excessive credit creation, as one of the causes of the financial crisis. Only so-called full money created by the central bank is to be regarded as means of payment. The banks would be reduced to mere intermediaries. They can lend only these means of payment that have given to them for this purpose by households, transferring them to some kind of saving account. Full money deposited in a checkable account cannot be used for that. So the proponents of this view hope to preclude bank runs, as households do no longer have to be worried whether a crisis will wipe out their checkable account. Saving accounts can still be hit in a crisis. Furthermore, by steering the amount of money brought into circulation by the central bank or the state, the proponents want to dampen business cycles. One can argue, I think, that it is highly doubtful whether the amount of expenditures can really be controlled by controlling the money supply. Limiting the amount of money in circulation might simply lead, as I said already before, to a more intense economizing on cash and an increase in lockstep behavior. Maybe it would also lead to the invention of other means of payment that are valid and trusted within a certain subsector of the economy. Nevertheless, these proposals are heavily discussed, at least in Germany. And in Switzerland, there will be a referendum on the introduction of such a system in the next few years, I think. Now, if one looks at the financial crisis, at the underlying forces leading to it, one cannot deny the fact that the large disruption came from large and unsustainable balances of certain sectors, especially the household sectors. But balances between revenues and expenditures as important factors determining or influencing business cycles did not play much of a role in mainstream macroeconomic models before the crisis. But I think the crisis has indeed shown that these large balances can lead to unsustainable developments that can change the direction of the economic process, and it can also lead to a financial crisis. Before the crisis, only the deficits of one sector, the government sector, have been regarded as a problem by most economists. Only some, mainly post-Keynesian economists, regarded high levels of indebtedness as a problem. The most prominent example, of course, was Hyman Minsky, who was already quoted today with his so-called financial instability hypothesis. This hypothesis explains how financial fragility emerges endogenously over the business cycle. As an expansion precedes, rising asset prices and strong investment returns buttress optimistic expectations, and competing to develop capital assets and serve growing markets, firms take on more debt. So debt obligations rise absolutely and relative to income levels, and the expansion of liabilities permits asset prices to continue rising, but at some point the weight of obligations overwhelms the prospect of further gains, and asset pricing are exposed as unsustainable. This undermines confidence, leads to a collapse in investment and asset prices, and causes a possibly precipitous downturn in overall economic activity. It's interesting that Stützel himself already had an idea about financial stability when explaining his model case 3. He writes, my own translation, quote, this case number 3, shows that financial stability of the whole economy and financial stability of the single corporation do not need to go hand in hand, as it is often described. For one can see a very favorite climate on the capital market insofar as it facilitates the consolidation of their debt, that is, improve the financial stability of the individual corporation, can just contribute to an excessive increase of total expenditures and to an endangerment of the value of money, so that the financial stability of the aggregate economy is worsened. On the other hand, it can be the case that the central bank has to worsen consciously the possibilities of consolidating debt, that is, to impair the financial stability of individual corporations, to maintain the stability of the value of money, and to avoid an overheating of the business cycle. Of course, Stützel thought just about inflation and an overheated economy, but it seems to be straightforward to extend these considerations to include also the possibility of a financial crisis. Without going into the details of recent considerations and models developed in the wake of the financial crisis, one can safely say that they pay much more attention to the build-up of, in the end, unsustainable balances, especially if you look at households. Here, Stützel's considerations that a sudden change of households' net financial assets due to a change of consumption expenditures could lead to profit changes and therefore also changes of firms' expenditures worked in both directions. In the period before the financial crisis, many households increased their indebtedness, so that in the aggregate, households became a deficit sector in some countries. For example, Spain, which is my favorite example, because due to its government surpluses before the financial crisis, Spain was cited as a positive case study. And the negative balances of private households and corporate sector were totally disregarded. Of course, the effect of profits might be partially compensated by the large current account deficits, but when the resulting bubble burst, all indebted private units tried to decrease their liabilities and therefore decrease their expenditures to repair their balance sheets, which is why Richard Coe coined the term balance sheet recession. The question is, of course, which role the central banks played in the build-up period of the crisis. Sometimes it is argued that they should have increased interest rates much earlier to prevent the build-up of the bubble. But I think a good case can be made that the increases of asset prices were that large that it might have been difficult to prevent it by interest rate increases alone. And that a hawkish monetary policy might have contributed to negative effects in other sectors of the economy that are more interest sensitive. That is why such crises also make the case for stringent financial regulation beyond mere interest rate policy, and why I think that these kind of models belong to Stützel's case number 3. So with this systematic, it might have come to mind in the years before the financial crisis that there is a blind spot in most mainstream macroeconomic models, that large balances and especially large deficits of the private sector, especially the household sector, might pose a problem when the prices of the assets financed by this indebtedness go down or even collapse. So Stützel's approach gives a framework that can be fruitfully used to categorize different approaches to business cycles. And if one keeps in mind that all 4 model cases might have their merit, and that all 4 possibilities for upswings and downswings should be considered, it might help to develop a richer set of models and also of policy proposals to be better prepared for future developments or future crises. Now, my second example for a fruitful application of Stützel's balance mechanics comes from public policy. The question how a pension system should be organized. Regarding this question, there is always much talk about the importance of saving. And therefore, it is helpful to clear what saving actually can mean, because then some confusions concerning the pension system can easily be explained. Saving is used for quite different issues. Many macroeconomic controversies arise because different meanings of saving are equated with one another, or that they describe quite different processes. Therefore, it's important to clear which meanings the term saving can have in a macroeconomic context. And there are 4 of them. The first is increase of net worth. Here, saving means for the private household and the state the difference between net income in a period and consumption expenditures in the same period. For a firm, it denominates the firm's retained earnings. That is the difference between yield and cost in the same period that were not distributed to the owners of the firm. Second, increase of net financial assets. Here, saving is the difference between revenues and expenditures of the same period. If an economic unit has spent less than it has earned, her stock of net financial assets has increased. but not necessarily her net worth, as the increase of net financial assets can be the result of selling a tangible asset. Third, decrease of consumption. Here, saving means that an economic unit decreases his consumption expenditures compared to the consumption expenditures of the last period. This meaning is only applicable to private households and the state, as firms do not consume by definition. And fourth, shift to long-term assets. Saving is often meant to denominate not an increase of wealth, but a regrouping of wealth, especially within the group of financial assets. Saving in this sense means that already existing financial assets, say for example means of payment or the deposits on saving accounts, are used to buy longer-term assets, long-term bonds, shares, tangible assets. The stock of wealth does not increase. Only the composition of wealth changes in the direction of less liquid assets with a higher expected return. And these different meanings of saving must not be equated, even if they can coincide, of course. If a household wants to have a larger increase of net worth out of his given income, he has to decrease his consumption compared to an earlier period. And as households normally increase their net worth by increasing their stock of net financial assets, the three first meanings of saving coincide in this case. But if the household's income increases between the first and the second period, he can realize a larger increase of net worth and of net financial assets, meaning 1 and 2, without decreasing his consumption expenditures, meaning 3. That is, he can save without saving. He can increase his net worth without decreasing his consumption expenditure. Now, in national income accounting, saving always means increase of net worth. And taking this into account, it's quite simple to understand the famous equality of investment and saving. Investment and saving are always equal in a closed economy or in the world because each economic unit can increase his net worth by increasing his stock of net financial assets or by increasing his stock of tangible assets, investment. But in the aggregate, in a closed economy or the world, the stock of net financial assets is always equal to 0. So the global increase in net worth, saving, can only consist of an increase of tangible assets, investment. So saving in the aggregate consists of investment. Now, what does that mean for the pension system? The pay-as-you-go pension system, which makes up the core of most pension systems in the world, is said to be in danger due to lower birth rates, which makes it more difficult to ensure that in later decades, so it is said, the pensions can be paid by the then less populous working age generation. To fix, or at least to attenuate this problem, a move, or at least a partial move to a funded pension system is proposed. And such a system, the argument goes, leads to an increase in saving in the sense of an increased formation of net wealth. A prominent example is the proposal of the so-called Concord Coalition, an American think tank. It bears the title, "A Real Fix for Social Security Requires an Increase in National Saving." And this proposal is a prime example for equating or rather confusing the different meanings of saving. And that can be clearly seen from the following paragraph in this proposal, quote, "If the nation is to meet the rising demand for goods and services without imposing stifling tax rates, large deficits or high inflation, it must invest more to spur productivity so that greater resources can be produced by fewer people. The best way to achieve that is through increased national saving, public and private. When people and institutions save, they supply the capital to finance investments, which enhances productivity. It increases the amounts of goods and services each worker can produce. Without creating new saving, legislative restructuring of Social Security is a zero-sum game." Well, it's correct and incontrovertible that higher savings, in the sense of a higher macroeconomic net worth, can attenuate the problem of an aging society. On a macroeconomic or an aggregate level, net worth consists only of tangible assets, machines and equipment. increasing productivity and production, and therefore also increasing the income of a now smaller working population. But it is wrong to conclude that an increased saving of households leads to an aggregate increase in tangible assets. If, for example, you subsidize households' saving by an appropriate tax policy, it leads to an increase of households' stock of net financial assets if the policy is successful and increases household savings. This increase of net financial assets in the household sector necessarily corresponds to a decrease of net financial assets of another sector. For example, the profits of the corporate sector decreases as the yields or revenues flowing from the household sector have diminished. It's by no means apparent how this fall of yields or revenues should lead to an increase to corporate investment. And therefore, it's simply a false conclusion that is drawn, starting with the correct insight that an increase of aggregate net worth, an increase in society's tangible assets, facilitates higher social spending. Proponents of funded systems draw the wrong conclusion that an increase of household stock of net financial assets leads to such an increase in aggregate net worth, or is even identical to it. Only if households, and indeed each economic unit, strive for tangible assets from the outset and do not plan any changes in the net financial assets, then a different result is possible. This is the Lockstep case again. And indeed it would circumvent the problem. Households would demand newly produced tangible assets instead of consumption goods, and the firms would just have to restructure their production. That might take some time, but does not pose fundamental problems. To put it bluntly, if households save by building, demanding real estate used by themselves, and build up stocks of canned food for the retirement period, then there is neither a problem of insufficient demand nor a problem of coordinating saving and investment because they are identical. But surely this process does not match the reality of households saving. Towards the end of the Concord Coalition's proposal, another meaning of saving is introduced. Quote, "To save more, we must temporarily consume less, at least until the productivity benefits of higher saving kick in." And the authors may have in mind a situation of full employment, which makes a decrease of consumption in real terms necessary to free resources and workers that can be used for producing more capital goods. But again, it's questionable whether such a decrease of consumption can induce investment. If the households decrease their consumption before the investment has taken place, the result is simply a reduction of firms' revenues. It's very improbable that such a decrease of revenues is taken as a signal to increase investment. You could much more easily simply increase investment by an appropriate policy that might lead to a reduction of consumption, production of consumption goods. Therefore, the prices of consumption goods increases, and then you have higher profits, and these are the so-called savings that simply come into existence due to higher investment. The argument that a pay-as-you-go system leads to a reduction of households' savings and therefore to a reduction of real capital accumulation originates in a paper by Martin Feldstein of 1974. And here you find the origin of the mistake, I think. If one takes a closer look at this paper, it can be seen that the different meanings of saving are not distinguished clearly, or that Feldstein implicitly assumes lockstep behavior, respectively. The topic of the paper is whether the existence of a pay-as-you-go system reduces private household saving and whether it influences the date of retirement. The result of Feldstein's research is indeed that household saving, and according to his data, that must denote the increase of household stock of net financial assets, are reduced by 30 to 50%. And he concludes, quote, "The evidence that the Social Security program approximately halves the personal savings implies," is my emphasis, implies that it substantially reduces the stock of capital and the level of national income. He concludes from the fact that the yearly increases of households' net financial assets have greatly diminished the stock of capital, have greatly diminished after the introduction of pay-as-you-go systems, and the increases of tangible assets, he says, have also diminished. But he says that without actually checking the development of real capital formation. And his conclusion has then been adopted by many other subsequent authors, and when the Concord Coalition states in its proposal that, quote, many economists believe that social security's pay-as-you-go structure discourages household saving and hence capital formation, end of quote, they probably refer to Feldstein's paper. Yeah, that's my second example, and I hope I could show you the fruitfulness of Stützel's approach in applying either to economic theory here, business cycle theory, and also economic policy, clarifying debates on, for example, the pension system. So, and then I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.